Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this MSP industry webinar about compliance, right? So we wanted to do a webinar specific to IT service providers and managed services providers around the word compliance. And that word probably means a lot of things to a lot of people, but we're going to probably go down a lane you didn't think about, right? When I say compliance for MSPs, a lot of people think about security and conditional access and security frameworks and all sorts of stuff. This is a different type of compliance. This is going to be voice-enabled platform compliance, and we'll kind of define that as we're going forward. And so, for anybody who's watching this, who's from Canada or outside of the United States, separate place, and we'll do a separate industry update for you at another time. This is specific to the U.S. and U.S. Territories, states, all 50 of them, and then all those other people that are in the umbrella, but not necessarily states, but are on the North American numbering system in a U.S. area. So here we go. My name is George Bardisi. I'm founder and CEO of OneStream, powered by bvoip. We have two folks with us today from SipDrunk.com and their parent company, BCM1. We have Ben and Mitch, so thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, George.
All right, so let's kick this off. Here we go. All right, so here's the things we're going to kind of talk about today. Rough 30,000-foot overview, compliance, risk of complying, trace back request. What does that mean? Stir shaken, not the James Bond statement. And what does it actually mean for you? So I think it's important to understand that every industry has acronyms and terms, and we're going to try and not, talk over your head, because that's not the point of this. Trying to speak in English so that you can understand exactly where we're driving. And I'm going to open up the conversation coming from the MSP side on how does your business run. I'm going to probably take a line out of Mitch or Ben's mouth like, hey, we're not here to give you legal advice. Nobody's lawyers on this webinar. Not that I can, at least the people presenting aren't lawyers. So whatever we're telling you, definitely consult with whoever you think you need to consult with to make sure you're okay. Okay? Because we're not here to be the legal be all end all. But we are trying to give you the understanding of what's happening on a broader scale and what you need to understand so that you can make the appropriate modifications if needed to how you run your businesses. If nothing other than a heads up to what your end customers are about to go through so that you know and that you're proactively ahead of that conversation rather than running into a problem and you having to play the fire put her outer game when you don't have time or least expect it. So your business model matters. Okay. Are you a channel partner of another company? Right? You're not billing for it. Maybe you refer it, you get some sort of rebate or commission. I could rattle off all the names that we already know, right? Think big brand names here, right? A lot of you are, right? When I look at any IT MSP industry webinar and I look at the pie chart, it's like 1,000 slices, right? Everybody's doing a little bit with everybody depending on the time when they, rolled into this lane. Are you a channel partner of somebody else, but you are billing for the calling plan? I don't have to go much further than, do you buy Microsoft Teams as a tier 2 provider? Do you turn on Teams calling plans? And then do you invoice for them? That's you. You fit number 2, okay? Number 3 is kind of nouveau, but it's important. Did you have something built or did you build something new that's voice-enabled, okay? Think AI agents and alike, right? And I mistyped Twilio there, but like Copilot, OpenAI, Twilio, you built some sort of automation that's voice-enabled or message-enabled, then that's you. Or did you subscribe to something like that? Then the people who are selling that service to you are in that bubble. What does that mean? You're acting like a voice company. You're bundling and billing for calling plans and messaging, but you're actually not properly set up to do that. You're acting as a voice company, and you went through the process to become a voice company. Okay? We call that wholesale. or white label, if you would. And then lastly, and a lot of people I think fit into this category, do you take a lot of bills from a lot of third parties, and then do you aggregate them under your invoice and then turn around and invoice somebody else? It's a lot of MSPs fit into that category, right? I know we're talking about a specific category today, but like all the MSPs, IT service providers I run into buy a lot of technology from a lot of different places and they roll them up into one bill, right? Same conversation here, okay? So we'll talk about this thing at the bottom here. I'll let the Ben and Mitch kind of do their spiel, but bottom line is last administration, current administration, at this point, it doesn't matter. Here are the rules, right? Here are the rules of the road, and here's what they mean to you, right? If it's voice enabled and somebody can call or message to or from it, doesn't matter what your classification. What you're about to learn from this webinar applies to everybody. Don't care who the vendor is, don't care who the supplier is, don't care what logo's on the bill, all of them apply. So depending how you do business is how much work you may or may not have to do to deal with that. In some cases, you may have to do no work. And in some cases, you may have to do a lot of work. So we're going to try and spell that out for you so that you understand exactly what you're walking into. But George's opinion, if you're bundling, billing for calling plans, I don't care if you're indirectly acting that way, directly acting that way, reselling somebody else's stuff, acting, and again, don't need to go any further than Teams calling plans is the lowest hanging, example here. You might have a problem. You probably do. So please pay attention moving forward as to probably what's going to happen in the very near future. Oh, by the way, things that have always worked may soon be affected by what we're about to talk about. So, talked about Teams. Let's talk about Teams. We the long advertised, hey, SMS is coming to Teams calling plans. Well, has anybody been able to get it approved? Not many. It's a lot of people standing in line, right? So like things that you thought were automatic before, just press a button and it's on instantly, like microwave. Hurry up and wait. Stand in line. And it's not easy. It's getting harder, okay? So anything around messaging is probably a topic you probably already should have known about, especially here in the US with the major carriers. 10 DLC, if you haven't heard of that, feel free to Google it. We may browse over it with Mitch and Ben here in a second. That's a thing, and it ain't going away, and it's only getting worse. So I don't know if you knew this, but a lot of the reason it's getting worse is because of bad actors. It's usually what happens in life, right? Somebody abuses something, and then somebody has to go backwards and deal with that, and it affects everybody else. So as simple as you used to be able to text, be able to send a text message to a mobile number via email, right? Like George's cell phone number at txt.att.net, vtext.com, etc., right? Like every carrier had this basically free service to text any of their mobile subscribers. Sounds like that's on the way out the door. And in a lot of cases, it already is, okay? So Sprint was the first one. Boost Mobile, where you at? I love those commercials. T-Mobile, typo there. AT&T, just this past month in June, shut it down. Verizon's like kind of the last big man standing. But I gotta assume, like the airlines, when I start assigning seats, you start assigning seats. When I start charging for airline bags, you start charging for airline bags. I gotta suspect, and my hunch is that they're gonna shut it off too. So it's becoming harder on purpose because people are abusing it. Everybody gets the spam messages. They hit the button on their phone that says mark as spam and then it doesn't do anything, right? But like bottom line is this is what's at the root of that. So things that have always worked and were easy before are getting harder intentionally, and it's red tape harder, and it slows you down and it slows your customer down, especially when you're moving in between service providers. So if you had a service that had SMS enabled before, you moved to another solution, now you don't have it. How long? Could vary. It's not days. Could be weeks. Oh, but my customer needs that service. You need to think about that up front, right? Like as a service provider, as a consultant, right? As an IT company, like if you didn't know that, one of two things is going to happen. Your customer move service providers called you up and were unhappy, and like you're like, well, what do you want me to do about it now? You're coming to me after the fact. Or you're suggesting somebody moves the services, and then all of a sudden they lose functionality in their system for a long time. Like, better to have been proactive about trying to reduce that time or just be transparent up front before they lose something and get unhappy, right? You're in the middle of that conversation likely. Can't help but mention this exact scenario is not hypothetical. It actually happened. So back in 2024, we're not talking January, we're talking October. It's not even a full calendar year. Vonage just shut off all messaging across all accounts globally. They're a US-based company, and they have customers out of the country, but they're primarily, their traffic is here in the US and Canada. Let's just even say US. They just decided to turn the power off, and they left it off for months. So that's the type of thing that we're talking about. Not complying with some of the stuff we're going to be talking about in this webinar means you just get shut off. That may not be a good day if your customer needs to operate, right? Or you need to operate. So just trying to give you an understanding of what could happen. Well, let's look at what has happened. Don't need to stop any further than October of 24 with Vonage, who I would think is a pretty well-known name, on this side of the aisle. So feel free to Google it. You can fact check me. So we talked about, SMS and messaging. So now we're going to talk about what I think, this is George's opinion, take it for whatever it's worth. The conversation we're about to have in a little bit more depth probably means this, that outbound caller ID, which we're going to talk about in one breath, spam, right? My next slide is spam risk, spam likely, telemarketer. That's the first step of outbound caller ID. We're not going to go too deep into it in this webinar. That's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother session. But everybody's running into this at some level. At some, it's either really bothering you or your customer, or it sometimes happens and it's not a big deal. But it's the wild, wild west. And the first part of that is outbound caller ID. Why? Robocalling, spamming, people trying to say that they are who they, using your outbound number when they're not really that way. So what does that mean? Outbound caller ID. Where does that take us in the next little while? This is where I, George, personal opinion, think that it's going. Is that at some point in the near future, we can debate what the near future means, but relatively near future, your outbound caller ID that you can send from your account, your subscription, your AI agent, your, bolt a line onto your cable subscription service, triple play, you can only send out the caller ID that's on your account. That's what I think it's going to be restricted. So how does that affect you? Well, because the bad guys are abusing it, they're going to want to shut it off for everyone else. So that means if you use a third-party answering service and your customer, it could be you send your calls after 5 p.m. to a third-party knock or sock. Answer your calls, creates tickets, tries to work with your customer. Maybe it's a plumbing business that you support, and they send their calls to a third-party answering service. A medical office, a dental office sends their calls to a third-party answering service. The originator, the person who's calling's phone number is not going to make it to the other side because that number doesn't belong to your account. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to ask for that information because it's not going to automatically show up. That's going to throw kinks into the plan here because a lot of people expect that caller ID to be the actual caller on the other side, not the guy in between, right? But that's going to end up being your caller ID because you are only going to be able to send outbound caller ID on what's on your account. Again, is this definitive? Is this in stone? No. I believe this is coming. You take that for whatever it's worth. So I just put the things that came right to the top of my head, but all of these things will get affected, right? Do you have some sort of AI agent that makes calls for you, it sends messages from you? That's a third party service. They're not going to be able to send your outbound number. They're only going to be able to send the number on an account that you have opened up and validated that you are who you say you are and gone through the things we're about to talk about. So think about that. And that also applies to like the SaaS platforms that have some sort of calling enablement, right? Message enablement. So HubSpot, you can turn on calling in HubSpot depending on your subscription plan. Same with Salesforce, Zendesk, Freshdesk, keeps going on. But if the number that you want to go out is your main number, that's not going to happen anymore, right? Like you're going to have to call out from a different number. Well, I don't want to do that. Well, you'll probably be able to restrict your outbound number to like anonymous or unavailable, but how likely is someone going to answer that call? Or you're going to have to establish multiple accounts and go through this certification verification process multiple times in order to get it to show up as you. This is what's coming. Again, George's opinion, but I've seen enough to think that this is where it's going. We'll see what Ben and Mitch think here in a second. So that's why I categorize things that normally just always worked. It was easy. You press a button, it just appeared. Or this is the way it's always been. That's about to be a problem for you and your end customer, which then becomes your problem at some point, probably too. So I'm just passing these business use cases along to you so that when we get into this nitty gritty of what and why and what the rules say and why it's set up the way that it is, this is what it practically means to you. This is what the day to day effect is to you and your end customer. So we talked about messaging, we talked about answering services and call forwarding and voice-enabled SaaS platforms and AI agents, all the new rage. I know, they're fun. So I'm going to pass it on and bring in my experts, Ben and Mitch from SipDrunk.com, BCM1, and I want them to start explaining now the definitive stuff, right? And maybe they can give you their opinion. Again, not legal advice. I've given you a lot of what I think's about to happen based on what I've read, based on what I've seen. Again, not a lawyer, but I play a good one on TV. But I want these guys to now jump in here, introduce themselves, and spell out what we know is definitive and what's coming. Go ahead, guys.
Hey, thanks, George. This is Ben McLendong. I'm the general manager for e-commerce for SipTrunk, BCM1 company. I kind of want to talk to you guys about really helping you guys understand what's coming down the pipe and whether this applies to you or not. I need you guys to understand exactly what the rules and regulations are because you may think you're safe, and if you're not, we'll let you know exactly what you need to understand. Okay, number one, KYC, know your customer, know your business. This is now a regulation for folks who are in the wireless arena, or I'm sorry, voice arena. So whether you are a person who has a provider like bvoip directly bill your customer, or you guys wholesale your opportunities similar to what George mentioned, you still have to have some kind of form of know your customer, right? What does that really truly mean? It's basically like if you went back in time and you did a credit check on a business, right? You were checking Dun and Bradstreet, you were checking their location, et cetera, right? So more importantly, a lot of stress is coming on to providers like us from the FCC and our carriers and saying, how do we fight this, right? Number one is how do we know our customers, right? It's important to know that because one, if you do have what we call a traceback, and we'll kind of talk about what a traceback is, we need to respond back to the authorities to say, is this action or calling pattern valid or not valid? But more importantly, from a provider like us, we have zero tolerance, right? We will actually shut down the pipeline for voice calling. We'll do an investigation and we can always undo it. But if we don't undo it, right? I mean, as you can see, some of the providers out there have been getting clocked by the FCC for millions of dollars, right? So we will kind of want to avoid that. More importantly, from our perspective, we want to avoid that because we don't want to get our license taken away, because not only does it affect that individual situation, but it affects all customers downstream, right? So again, KYC, make sure you guys understand what that is. I'll give you two pieces of advice. One, we will, as a provider, start um, doing know your customers, KYC checking and vetting on dealers and their end users, right? So whether you are a dealer or end user, we have to check your customer if we direct bill you. Now, more importantly, if you wholesale, things that George talked about, rewrap a solution into your package and then sell it to your customer, you're considered wholesaler. You own that process. Okay, so what does it entail? Next slide, George, please. Okay, so again, really the KYC is to really identify your customers and partners, mitigate calls, but more importantly, right, again, who owns KYC? If we, again, keep this in the back of your mind, if we as a provider direct bill your end user customer, we as a provider will actually take action and own the KYC process. Now, what does that mean to you as a person right in the middle? That means that we as a provider will go to your customer directly and get some CPNI information, right? So we will actually guide you, the partner, the dealer, and your customers through the process proactively. And then once that process hits your doorstep or your customer's doorstep, they know exactly what actions need to be taken, right? What does that mean to us, right? We actually reach out to the customer via link. They fill out the CPNI information, and then we put it through a 20 data point analysis, right? Where they're located, IP addresses, things of that nature. And if it looks good, we will actually manually approve the services and that gets turned on, right? If they're missing information or the ID is incorrect, we'll come back and try to resolve that. But a good majority of the time, what we're finding is a lot of opportunities, not you guys, but folks that come to us directly. We're seeing a lot of fraud, right? We're seeing a lot of bots. Matter of fact, today we saw 200 plus applications go through our system and it was through a bot. So we've got to get real um, tight on that, right? For a wholesaler,
So let
again,
me
a
so let me
person.
so let me pause real quick just to make sure
Mhm,
we're on the same page. All right.
mhm,
So Ben, if somebody watching this webinar has potpourri of different people that they've signed up with over time, right? Could be,
correct.
I don't
Yep.
know, Ring Central, Nextiva, Vonage, could be Jive, could be Teams calling, Zoom phone. I could
Mhm.
keep going on. How likely is it that sometime in the almost immediate or very near future, all of those services have to go back to every existing subscriber and validate with some sort of business registration check or request information from all of those customers in order to validate who they are?
Yep, yep, good question. Every one of them are going to do that. We are going to do that. We're looking at for partners like yourselves to do it starting January 1st, 2026. So whether your current providers, unlike us, are informing you of this situation, they will go through that process. They're probably in the same phase we're at, where we're checking brand new applications, but eventually we have to go back and look at our existing base. More importantly, the way we describe it internally is we're looking for ticking time bombs because it's not worth us having a customer who's going to go out there and cause havoc, and then of course we lose our license. So eventually, like George mentioned, every carrier, no matter who they are within the US, will vet every existing customer, even though they've been on board for quite some time.
So,
George?
so, so, so let me ask this question. Let's say, and again, this is a hypothetical because we don't know yet.
Hmm.
We know they have to deal with it. We just don't know the mechanism, right?
Hmm.
So let's say I'm a MSP. I got a ton of Microsoft accounts, which is very usual. Some of those accounts have Teams calling plan. Microsoft's using bandwidth.com upstream for all of their US calling plans, right? Underneath the hood. They're going to have to go back to every single one of those customers and maybe in their portal or via some sort of notification, like an email or some sort of heads up that they need to press a button and do something, right? It's not just going to be automatic.
Correct. Right. Yep. There's going to be manual intervention. There's going to be intervention from your direct end users. and or possibly the dealers if the service is for the dealer itself, but more likely it's for your customers and users. They will have to take some action on their side. Correct.
So what kind of validation paperwork are they going to be asking for? Is this as simple as, hey, upload your business registration certificate, or like what is the types of documents that they would probably ask for?
Yeah, correct. So a couple things, right? Proper email domains, right? And two, prove you actually work for the company. There's going to be an ID check where you maybe take a picture of your ID, your proof of Dun and Bradstreet. Again, we go above and beyond. We do 20 data points. Some people are doing 5 data points. One of the things that I can tell you right now, the FCC, if you read their outline of KYC, they're very detailed as far as what it means. They're very harsh when it comes to penalizing you, but they're not very prescriptive as far as to tell you you need to do 15 data points, right? We took the same tools that the FCC uses, which is a product called Persona, and we run all our customers through that process, right? We use Umail. So to your point, George, there will be scenarios where we will take a look at the longevity of some customers, right? And say, hey, they've been good. And we'll kind of, auto fill in some of the components for them that we have, and then some components that we don't have, we'll go back to them and say, hey, can you fill in the blanks? But yes, it gets very detailed to a point again where we've had some where we've had to have them prove that they actually work for the organization. So get ready for that. We are prepping a lot of communication for folks like bvoip and others to say, here's what's coming down the pipe. Here's what you can do proactively. Here's what we have on hand. And more importantly, I want to stress this: your customers have to fill it out. I can't have a dealer fill it out, because if IP address or emails or point of contacts don't match, then it'll delay the process, right? So more importantly,
Okay, hold on, rewind. So let me take a guess. Whoever the bill copy goes to, right? Like,
Right.
whoever, when they originally opened up the account, said, send all invoices to here. That's probably, I'm just guessing, the first place a message like this goes to. Hey, you need to click on this and do stuff, right? And like, who knows what that email is? Could be a distribution group, could be invoices at, accounts payable at, whatever. And we're talking to the end customer here, not unless the MSP themselves is the end customer, which in a lot of cases they could be. But if they have a customer on any service and that bill isn't coming from them, then it's going to whoever that bill's, could be a letter in the mail, likely an email is the first step. Let's say they don't respond, Ben. Let's say, like, hey, you got an email 3-4 times in a row, maybe like 3, 4, 5 months in a row. Nobody responded. Nobody clicked on the link. Nobody, provided the information. Now what? What could happen?
Worst thing that can happen is service is terminated, right? So to your point, we will have multiple points of contact, whether it be email multiple times, whether it be a full verbal reach out, but we will give everybody an opportunity to respond in a timely manner. But ultimately, if we don't get a response, we have to, by the FCC's mandate, is cut off service if we can't get know your customer validated.
So in the hypothetical where Microsoft sends out or RingCentral or whoever, and that's not going to go to the partner, it's going to go to the end customer. And sometimes your end customer, right? They have staffing changes just like any organization, or they don't pay attention to their email, or it's going to a shared mailbox that isn't monitored until there's a problem. Could be a problem, right? Could be an issue.
That is right.
So heads up, right? Because this validation process, doesn't matter who the logo is industry wide here, right? They're all going to have to deal with it. And anyone who buys from the people at the top are also going to have to deal with it, because it follows the same concept of who's billing for it, right?
Correct. Right. Exactly. Let's move to the next slide, if you don't mind, George.
Real quick before we do, like,
Yep.
truth in calling. Could you just spend 2 minutes on that? What does that mean?
Yeah, correct. I mean, it basically is the same thing like understanding know your customer, right? They really want to prohibit any kind of misuse, prohibit transmission, inaccurate caller ID. This is the next thing that's going to come down the pipe. If you guys are familiar with SMS on 10DLC, think about outbound voice calling. That's going to be the next 10DLC, which is a precursor or the beginning of KYC, right? I mean, so again, this is all coming down the pipe, and we're really getting in front of the train before it really happens. And I'll kind of talk about a date and time when we should be prepared, and there's a couple more steps that we'll talk about.
And
Okay.
then also the truth in billing. I think I kind of skipped over that in one of the earlier slides. Can you maybe just talk about that for 30 seconds?
Yeah, truth in billing. I mean, how you bill your customer, line items that you bill for them. And by the way, I mean, for us, we've taken additional steps to really validate if they are using proper credentials, payment methods, et cetera. I mean, all of that comes into play where, we've got to validate who the end users are, whether they're users or whether they're paying the bills. Everything's got to be validated. So.
And then I think there's I don't know if it's in the next slide, but I'm going to ask now, like a categorization question. What are you
Mhm.
using your services for?
Yes, yes, exactly. We will be reaching out to the customers to kind of validate, you'll have dialers out there, you'll have users that just use it for incoming, some outgoing. We need to know just in not detailed formats, but just get an understanding exactly what they're using it for. The reason why we need to catalog that is if the FCC comes to us and says, "Hey, we're seeing some fraudulent activity here. What was your KYC steps and what was the response from the customer and how are they using it?" So this is just getting in front of the train, right? When it hits a station, we have to be prepared. If we don't have those answers when the FCC comes calling, then we're liable, right? So we are liable for saying, "Hey, if we direct bill your customer, then we should have already had that in place," right? So again, very, very, very key. These are some components that we ask for, like George mentioned, business name, address, EIN. These are, again, if you think about the olden days, a credit check. It's the same process. This wasn't called KYC years ago. Now this is a KYC today, but we're going even further with domains, email addresses, IP addresses. Again, there's a lot of components that we use, risk assessment tools, right? Again, we use actually three. We use SIFT, MaxMind, and Persona to evaluate not only incoming applications or requests, but we will use those same tools for existing customers down the road. Ongoing monitoring mitigation. It really also for the folks who are considered wholesalers, you have to have some kind of mitigation, ongoing monitoring. And again, some components we'll talk about in a second. But yes, this is an ongoing component. You can't set it and forget it. This is one where you're going to have to do some auditing if you are responsible for KYC, stir shaking, and RMD registration.
All right. So let me
Okay.
try and repurpose this conversation a little bit, more, simpler English.
Mm-hmm.
Your end customer is going to be contacted in the near future to validate themselves. And if they don't respond, problem. If
Correct.
they get flagged through that process and they don't remediate whatever the concern is of the upstream provider, problem. And then what is your business model, right? As an MSP, IT services provider, whatever you categorize yourself, how are you in the middle of this? Are you just, vendor management, they're paying somebody else directly as their end customer, and then you're just providing support services to them? Cool. Now you just know what's coming down the line. You need to make sure to watch out for this because if you don't respond, worst case scenario, one day stuff stops working, power's out, right? No good, right? But let's say if you're on the other side of the agenda, you're aggregating and then rebilling, or you're billing for Microsoft voice calling plans, or you're legitimately white labeled as a voice provider, or maybe you're not legitimately, billing as a voice provider. Now it's worse. Now you need to go and deal with all of these things. You want to say, I don't even know where to start. This looks expensive. It is. It's tax as compliance. I don't think I would label it as anything else, but it costs money to handle it. So just like you're hearing about what's being done, in the case of a major provider, as BCM1, SipDrunk.com is like, hey, here's what we're already planning to do. You would need to do this on your own if you're the guy, if you're the invoicer. So the question you got to ask yourself is, do I want to be doing that? And if the answer is no, you're going to have to do something to change whatever it is you're doing to get out of the middle of it. So
That
just
is right. Yep.
being super clear, right? So that there's no surprise, because this doesn't come, without strings. I would argue the rope and the chains are coming. We're past string. Okay. All right.
Next slide, George.
Next slide. Here you go.
So real important, right? I crossed out June 20th for folks who George just labeled wholesalers, rebuilders, et cetera, that you guys repackage the solution and then you sell your cake to the customer. Stir Shaken was due on June 20th. The FCC actually has delayed the June 20th. And here's the latest that I know. Okay. Bottom line is FCC is going to send the industry, the carriers in the beginning, a note, a letter saying, here is the revised requirements letters. And within 30 days of receipt of that, that is the new target date for wholesalers to be stir shaken, KYC, RMD compliant, right? Again, I want to reiterate, like George mentioned in the beginning, is I'm not giving you advice, right? You can look it up, RMD, Robo Mitigation Database. Look it up, go to FCC, look at their description, follow their lead. KYC, same thing, go to the FCC, right? Stir shaken, same thing there, right? So if you aren't, you will get penalized for passing traffic if you are not registered in the RMD, number one, which basically RMD is one that is interesting, is they will ask you to explain who you are, what you do, what you use, your infrastructure, how you go to market, and then how do you handle KYC and how do you handle stir shaken? Okay. So all of that is very key for folks who rebill, for folks who are having bvoip or SipTrunk bill directly to your customer. We, SipTrunk, do the heavy lifting. We will do the call signing, stir shaking, KYC, and we're registered in the robo mitigation database. Again, new letter coming out 30 days. Once the letter hits is when the new date is going to be effective.
So
okay.
basically, from all, anybody who's practical, my opinion, you're in bonus time now. Like at any point
Yes.
tomorrow, a letter could be in the mail and bam, the clock's already rolling.
That's
So
right.
like this, it's coming, it's already here.
That is right. They've actually given a bonus for folks who aren't ready, right? So we were talking in Denver in June, talking to a group, and I couldn't tell you how many eyes were like, wow, I didn't know this, right? So we're giving you fair warning for folks who are wholesalers and consult with bvoip on your options, right? But more importantly, call signing. I think that's the biggest hurdle there, which is this is what it is, right? Meaning that
So let me pause, right? Like
yep.
this is very complex and we're going to try and make it Fisher Price here for you, but in a nutshell, what we're about to say is this is like you attaching an SSL certificate to your applications, right? Like when you got to put up a website and it's like, hey, you got to create a CSR, and then you got to go like to a certificate provider, you got to get an SSL cert of some type, and you got to import it into your web app so that when you go to the browser, you go to onestream.com or siptrunk.com, right? Whatever the website is, it says that it's You don't get the, hey, there's a problem, the certificate's not good. It's kind of like that, right? But a lot more
Yeah.
intricate. Where in a nutshell, what they are trying to do with this process right here, which we're about to explain, is every single call, they want to be able to find exactly where it started, how it transited, and where it ended, end to end. Right now, that's not the case. So, I could be somebody from overseas. I could register for a service that's US based, could start making a ton of phone calls. And they're like, well, where did this traffic come from? Right. Or I could send my calls from an international location into the US North American system. And they're like, well, where did this come from? We lose visibility once we cross the ocean. That is exactly what they are trying to do right here. They want to see every single hop across the transit of any communication, message or call, to make sure that they knew where it originated, how it transited, what hops, what carriers, and destination. That way, if a complaint comes through, they should be able to almost instantly determine what happened. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks. So I'll say one more thing and I'll hand it off to Mitch. What you're seeing here, folks, is, and Mitch will kind of explain this, is call signing. Okay. Again, if you're a wholesaler rebilling, you have the responsibility of signing your calls and grading your calls from A, B, or C. There's three different options, right? One is you do it yourself. Two is you look at, on the right-hand side, you see Sensei and Transnexus. Those are examples of third parties who will do that for you. You still have to register and get your token, but they will do that for you. Or three, use a provider who will directly bill your customer, and that will actually keep you safe. With that said, Mitch, if you wouldn't mind taking over the next slides, and it'll kind of go towards
Absolutely.
the more important thing, which is where do you fit within the model?
Yeah, thanks, guys. And I think just to kick off from where George and Ben were, we're a little bit downstream now, right? There's a reason we start with KYC. And I think George's second to last slide about what's going to happen from a caller ID standpoint, and what Ben just laid out from a bunch of different lingo now with tokens and registration and all that. But at the end of the day, you start with know your customer for those bad actors that are doing the bundle of services or the wholesale portion, as Ben mentioned. This is what this is intended for. So from a SIP trunk BCM perspective, again, this is what we've had to do to be compliant. I can't tell you the amount of questions we've gotten over the last month, really, because it's been a month since June 20th, of what do we need to do to go get a token to be registered in the RMD. So there's been a ton of, I'd say, misinformation out there from some other carriers. But at the end of the day, Stir Shaken's been out there for a while. I think it's first got punched out end of 22, if I'm not mistaken. But it's really just a framework to hit on what George was saying, right? Can we figure out where a call is coming from, who it came from, and who owns it, right? So that's really the framework of Stir Shaken, and it comes from the bad actors, right? So if you think about 10DLC, like George mentioned, it looks, smells, and feels a lot like that, right? So you're going to start seeing it. It's already happened with the way Stir Shaken's written out. You need a digital certification to sign these calls. So again, not to steal George's thunder, if you're working with OneStream and bvoip and SIP trunk from a calling standpoint, we're doing that. This is for you. This is for the folks that are bundling it together. Maybe they're not registered in the RMD. Maybe they didn't think they need to be. Again, back to George's point of it used to work, now it might not. That's what Stir Shaken is. So there's a few different components to it, starting with know your customer. If us as a provider we don't know your end user, you're going to have to own not only the KYC portion, but also the Stir Shaken portion, which are all those other registration items that Ben mentioned. So again, impact, just to wrap it up on this slide to George's point, someone has to own it, right? So do you want to go through the process to do that, which we'll talk a little bit more about here, or do you want someone else to take that for you? Again, a lot on here, a lot of lingo that you probably don't need, but just to summarize this, right? who signs the calls with the digital certificate, that has to be obtained from a service provider or a SPID number. So again, if someone like SipTrunk and BCM1, if the bill is to the end user, the carrier will handle that. If it's not, if it's to you, the MSP or the partner, you're going to have to go through proof, right, that you know the customer and that you have signed that call. So I think George had a great point earlier in terms of forwarding and some of the other bullets listed there from passing on that caller ID, AI agents, right? You're going to have to go through this. So again, the B and C, that's what the wholesale, the bundler is going to have to call out, right? So are you going to sign it with a B or C? Do you really want to go through the process of getting your own certificate, having someone on staff or a third party to then sign these calls? As Ben mentioned, you're going to need to still have certain certificates and tokens to pass on to that third party provider to then do this. So pause right there. I know that was a lot from a stir shaken standpoint. The second component of the call signing piece is the RMD. So again, from that standpoint, I've seen a few things here. This is where the legal advice portion comes in. They will ask, how you're going to market today. So back to George's slide on business model matters. If it's not described correctly here, there could be issues. Yep. Here's one more. And that. So again, if you're describing yourself as thank you, George. You're describing yourself as, oh, I'm just a reseller, right? I don't mark anything up. I just pass it on. This is what you're going to need to describe correctly for an RMD registration. We've had multiple partners come to us and say, my attorney said I was I needed to partially be set up with the RMD. Okay, have that ready, right? There's multiple different ways you can go to market, as you've mentioned here. The safest one, again, is if from a telecom standpoint, you're having someone else bill that end user. So take everything here, package it in together, and if you don't describe that correctly to the RMD, you're going to be listed incorrectly. So I'll just pause right there again, just to kind of recap it, right? Start with KYC, moves on to call signing, which is a portion of, the framework of Stir Shaken. And then, are you registered in the robocall mitigation database? When we've surveyed partners, and I think the stat from last week might have came from George, might have came from Ben, when we sat down with a group of trusted partners last week from our standpoint, 80% of partners are in that model of that rebilling, rebundling portion. And when we went around that room, I think one of them was registered as certified at the RMD. So just think about that right there. There's going to be a lot of communication on this. I don't think it takes too long to go through that process, but get ahead of it now. If you are going to market that way, again, if you're not, you're working with George's team, you're covered.
Yeah. Again, real world. I'm a Microsoft partner. I buy through distribution as a tier 2 Microsoft partner. I turn on a Teams calling plan. I pass that through on my MSP master invoice. That's it. That's all that needs to happen for you to be you got to do this. Stinks. So Don't do that. What's the alternative? Have your end customer pay Microsoft directly. Now you're not in the middle of the transaction. No problem. It sounds so simple, but it's so costly. I can't say it more definitively. That's all it takes. That's as little as you need to do to be into the middle of this. So please pay attention.
Absolutely. And we want to jump to the next one. Here's the nitty gritty of it, right? So again, from a cost standpoint, if you do decide to go out and do this, again, back to truth in billing, what needs to be included in this robocall mitigation plan? This is something that we're going through internally, right, to be compliant as a carrier. But are you really again, you guys need to focus on what you focus on. We know voice is just a small component of that. Are you going to have steps to prevent illegal robocalling? How did you vet it? How are you monitoring the traffic? And the big one, which I know George mentioned and Ben mentioned, 24-hour response time. That is no joke, right? We've already actually gone through that in certain situations. If there is a traceback, it's either shut off account and you have to respond. If you do not respond, they're going to start digging into other things as well from a business standpoint. So I think the big thing with all this can be wrapped up in, are you going to have, the support team to respond to a traceback request in 24 hours? And again, it's actively enforced, and that's where the nasty fines come in, which again is going to look a lot like what you see on the 10 DLC side, right? George mentioned the immediate shutoff of Vonage. I think a couple of his points on the outbound portion, we're getting closer to this. So it's just a matter of when those 30 days kick in. And again, how do you want to be set up? If you want to go down this route, you're going to need to have plans for this in place. So,
So let me rewind. All right. So a traceback, right? What starts a traceback? Somebody complains that they got something, a message or a call from what seems to be a spam, fraud. Hey, we're Microsoft support. Can we remote into your computer? We're the IRS, right? Like all these gimmicks and, people who are trying to bamboozle people, right? There's so many examples of this happening at scale, right? Hey, we're QuickBooks support. I mean, just Google it. There's pages and pages of these scenarios. But effectively, it could be somebody dialing as simple as they call 911. And they, the local 911 in your area is like, hey, we're trying to figure out what happened to this, and we can't figure out who called us. And now we're trying to figure out if, there's a problem, right? So like a lot of things can trigger what this quote unquote trace back request is. But in a nutshell, it's once a formal request has been put through, which, it's easy for them. You press they fill out a form and press a button to start this process. It takes them 5 minutes to start a trace back. Now it's on you, and you're under the pressure cooker to respond. And here's the problem. The response comes back to all the stuff we just talked about. We need all of the information on these calls, these numbers, the customer, their profile, how did you validate them? Like they're going to ask for all of it in one shot. You don't have time to get to do that ad hoc in 24 hours, especially if the request came in at night or on a weekend or on a holiday. They don't care. So imagine you get a request, a traceback request on 4th of July, and you got to respond by the 5th of July, and you got to respond back with all that information in one shot. You got to move quick. You don't have time to wait for the end customer to respond to you then. This is the whole point. And by the way, this $239,000 per violation, I don't know what the teeth is to enforce that. I guess I'll go read it too, but per violation, per call, per message. I mean, one call, right? How many calls happen in an hour? It adds up quick. And then if you don't respond, if what Mitch is saying is, hey, they gave you 24 hours, maybe they even gave you a grace period. Maybe you got an extra 10 hours on top because, they knew they sent you the message on the 4th of July. And if you don't respond, what Pandora's box get open now? Do they go to your upstream provider on top of you and say, shut all the traffic off to this guy?
Yep.
I think so. I think that's very likely. And if that happens, you don't have, you just powers out, guys. Powers out to your customer, powers out to you. That's a bad situation. It's effectively an outage that was self-inflicted. So, not good. So,
spot on. I think we can wrap this up. Just to bring it full circle here, if you want to click once more, George, you guys are covered. I guess one more again. If you're working through George's team, this middle model here, which we call dealer on our side, but again, the key here is truth in billing, direct bill to that end user from us. We're registered. We've gone through. We have the team in place. We're responding to those traceback requests. We're handling the taxation. We own the infrastructure. And guess what? As Ben started with, we can do the KYC on that if we need to, right? Which we will get to next year. Now, again, working through partners such as yourselves, it's a lot easier to obtain that than it would be in your traditional wholesale kind of bundle portion, which is on the far right there. So a majority of our conversations, and we're going through this internally as well, are with partners on the far right that, to George's point, have done it a certain way. They built up their business and they don't have all of that, right? I think a lot of folks are going to have a few of those things. Infrastructure being the key one, a lot of folks won't have. RMD registration would be the other one. And even if you do go get that, do you want to have the rules and the people in place to respond to requests and to own it? So again, I think to wrap up, I don't want to steal George's thunder, but to wrap up, I would get with OneStream and his team, see where you guys sit from a voice-enabled platform, and go from there.
100%. So again, public service announcement is coming for every provider. Everybody. Doesn't matter. So if you walked away out of here saying, well, hey, I'm good, well, then you know your end customer is going to get this in the very near future. It'll look really good if you are proactive and they heard it from you first, because now you're the smart person in the room, right? Awesome. For you, for the services you use in your own IT services, MSP business, cool, you're going to get it. And if you're consuming that service from an upstream provider, they're coming to get, they're treating you like the end customer. Make sure you're monitoring your billing email or wherever your invoices go to or bill goes to, because that's probably where it's going to start. First notification. Hey, we need some information from you. Or I assume for the Microsofts of the world, in your partner portal, you'll get a banner or whatever, right? Like it's coming for everybody. And then like, hey, just be aware, right? That if something's not in place or you're in a problem zone, start figuring it out now. Do not wait for your upstream provider or app or SaaS platform or AI agent guy or whoever to come to you last minute and then you're in trouble. This is also a good idea to think about how you continue to operate moving forward when you add net new services. If you've gotten into the I'm building AI agents as a service business, awesome. Do those AI agents send messages, and do they make phone calls, and do they call forward? Because if they do, you're going to have to deal with all this. Sucks, but it is what it is. You heard it here first, hopefully. And if you didn't, then cool. We're right on track with what you're supposed to know when you're supposed to know it. So there's that. Am I covered? Well, we just talked about it. Where do you sit in the business model, right? And we want you to be protected. I saw a hand go up, so I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can. Who put their hand up? I see a hand up. No? Good. Questions? Now's a good time. If you have any questions, I know we're coming right up to the end of this. Either raise your hand or pop it into the Q&A, and I'm trying to answer any questions on the fly here. But while you're doing that, we recorded this. We're going to share it. I mean, if anything, it's a public service announcement for all. It's not specific to our business, but for anybody in IT services, MSP land, this is something good to know. And prepare properly and communicate with your customers if you have them on the other side. Even if this is not part of your service offering, they're going to get messages from whoever they're buying from. So just be ahead of that. And then you're the trusted advisor. You're telling them, hey, here's what's coming down the pipe. Make sure to keep your eyes out. We don't want your service to get shut off unknowingly, right? Like that's the kind of stuff you're trying to avoid. Last call for questions or raise hand. Now's a good time. All right, got a Q&A right here. Let's see. If we are a reseller, are we able to work with members of the bvoip team to get things set up correctly? Is there someone specific we can contact there? Sure. Why don't you just drop me a line and we'll start with there, and I can see if I can get you to the right place. So, yeah, send me a message, me, George, right? Drop me a line. We'll get a quick call going. We'll figure out where you're at and where you need to go. Hopefully, a lot of the people we work with in MSP land, the answer is not much for you to do. You're already in a good place. We're just giving you a heads up on what's coming down the line. But if you're on the other side and you are in the other categories that means you got to start to deal with these things, yeah, there's a long line of things you're going to need to do, and we can at least give you some pointers on where to start. Especially if you're somewhere in the middle and you are rebilling, invoicing, or bundling, that means you're gonna have to go down column 3, and there's a lot of work to be done. So feel free to drop me a line. Happy to help, get you in the right lane. Just be ready and get your sleeves rolled up, and a lot of work to do. All right. Thank you very much. We're perfectly 1 hour in. Mitch and Ben, I appreciate you taking your time to jump into this. For everyone else, hopefully I didn't have your googly eyes out after all of this. Hopefully we made it into English that you can understand. I know it's a very technical topic. By the way, don't take our word for it. Go to the FCC website. It's all there. Start Googling. I think you'll find that all the stuff we just talked about is out there. We didn't just make it up. If we resell multiple clients, does this need to be done per client? Yes. The answer to your question is every single client is going to have to go through, and Mitch and Ben, just fact check me here, every separate separate account, right? Like if it's a separate customer who's billing separately, who's getting an invoice separately, who's transacting separately, then every single one of those is going to have to do that, right?
That is right. So net, every single account. So if it's an account, it's got to be vetted through KYC.
So it's almost like you asking for someone's, I don't know, tax exemption form, right? Like they got to provide one to you with their number and their signature. And I'm just giving you an example of another scenario, right? But you can't do that for them. They got to do it and give it to you. And I think they, got to re-highlight one thing, and you maybe didn't hear it as we were going through. You cannot do this on your customer's behalf. They have to do it. They're going to have to upload their documents. They're going to have to provide their driver's license. They're going to have to provide their proof that they work for the company, right? That's the kind of stuff that you won't be able to do on their behalf. But you're probably going to have to do it for your own account because, wherever your services are coming from, same question's going to be asked to you, right? For your internal services. That you can do. All right. Oh, wait, there's more. Is there any helpful breaking the new type documentation we can inform for our customers? Yeah, it's a good question. So earlier in this slide deck, we kind of went through some of the things that they were talking about. It sounds like more documentation's coming through, Ben and Mitch, but sounds like between, you may already be doing this for new customers, it sounds like. So let's assume the situation, I have a new customer signing up for services. What type of things could they expect you're going to ask them for?
Yeah, like Ben mentioned, we can wrap it up on that slide, but business name, kind of like a credit check. So again, if you're working through one stream in the team today, you're good. More to come on what it's going to look like in the future. If you're going through a different model, it's going to be a credit check on steroids, best way to say it. You'll have a ID and some of that other stuff too.
Right.
Yeah.
So the reality is that the workflow today may have not changed, but it's going to change in the near future. Is that what it sounds like?
That is
Correct.
right. That is right. One thing to note, folks, is for organizations like bvoip, we're actually going to be throwing partner webinars to kind of dissect KYC responsibilities of what's coming down. So we'll give you a good flavor of what is needed by the client, so you are fully aware. And communication is key for us. So I think again, we'll get it out in front of you guys sooner than later, and at least you guys hear it up front before the actual due date. Again, what we're looking at January 1 is we're going to start looking at the existing base of current clients. Any new clients going forward will need to go through the current process.
Okay. So we'll get some documentation from the team here to kind of spell out, hey, prepare the following things so that when you get the link to create, your calling plan account or your SMS account, you're going to ask for these things. Have them ready, right? We'll work to try and prepare you for that. All right. Thanks for those questions. All good ones. Thank you very much for watching this. Again, it was recorded. Make sure a copy of that recording makes it out to everybody who registered. And again, Ben and Mitch, thanks for taking an hour plus of your time to help spell all that out. We'll be back in touch with you, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks, George.